Over to you, Mel.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this second panel session of the UK Pre-Galien Forum. My name is Mel Walker. I'm an advisor and provide fractional CCO services to biotech and digital health companies. I have a passion for patient access, so I'm delighted to be moderating this excellent panel today. But before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, I wanted to share something with you that happened actually a month ago now. I received a telephone call from the CEO of an international patient organisation, and they were extremely concerned about an article they'd read. And they wanted me to look at this article and give them a view on it, so they sent the article over. The article was entitled Lecanemab, the Price of a Breakthrough. I actually noticed there's a couple of people in the audience that may have heard me tell this exact same story a couple of weeks ago at a conference I was chairing a panel at, but I will draw some different conclusions out today, so bear with me. Anyway, the article basically looked at all of the eligible patients for lecanemab in the Swedish healthcare system. Now, lecanemab is for mild cognitive impairment. They worked out that the eligible patient population at the price of 26,000, which was the US list price, would essentially cost the Swedish healthcare system 2.6 billion US dollars. Now, if you compare that to the total drugs budget in Sweden, which is about 3.5 billion, you can see why this lady was concerned. She was concerned about the patients that she was advocating for actually having access to a medicine that seemed potentially unaffordable. So I think the three things I'd like to draw out of that is obviously the issue of affordability. I think that's going to be a topic for today's panel, certainly. And I would say that affordability is now an issue for all major markets globally. If we think about even in the US, which was relatively price insensitive, now with the Inflation Reduction Act, we can see that now they're getting price sensitive and affordability is on their radar too. I think the second point is around unmet needs and the priority for different unmet needs in different geographies. My mother suffers from Alzheimer's, so I'm definitely one of the ones who would like to see more developments in that space. However, when you think about unmet needs and life expectancy, obviously Alzheimer's disease increases dramatically with age. So maybe in some markets with lower life expectancy, Alzheimer's, it may not be a priority to address that particular unmet need, and there may be other unmet needs that take priority, and that's as it should be. And the third point I should have also mentioned in the paper, that it talked about diagnostics and actually the need to provide diagnostics at scale in order to identify those patients that could receive lecanemab. And it talked about the challenges of delivering that at scale within a healthcare system that was not set up to do that, but also the cost of doing that. And so I think that leads me on to my third point that could be a theme for today, which is really about healthcare system implementation. Maybe in higher income markets, it might be more around ATMPs and CAR-Ts, for example. But I know that in low and middle income markets, it may be different aspects. Like the question I asked earlier was about multi-dose files versus single-dose files, cold storage, some of these things, the ability, not just the capacity, but the capabilities of the system to deliver new medicines to patients. And this is a key theme for patient access. So with that, I'm delighted to have a panel of global leaders in this space here with me today. I'm going to do a very quick fire round and ask people to introduce themselves. Maybe I'll start with you, Mac, and we can go this way. Just your name, your organisation, maybe a couple of comments about what your organisation does. And then once we've done the introductions, we'll kick into the meat of the panel.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mac Lumpkin. I lead the global regulatory systems initiatives for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We focus not on specific products. There are other parts of our organization that does that, but my group focuses on the regulatory systems through which global health products have to go in order to be legally procured and used in the low-income countries that we focus on. So we focus on WHO PQ, we focus on the national regulatory authorities in low-income countries, the harmonization initiatives, and the work with high-income country regulators who provide a tremendous amount of the technical assistance that is needed as we try to optimize the regulatory space for global health products. I've been with the foundation for about 10 years, and before that, I was at the US FDA for 25 years.
Thank you, Mac. Sam?
Hi there, my name's Sam Roberts. I'm the Chief Exec of NICE. So we assess the clinical and cost effectiveness of about 100 medicines a year in this country, about 80 devices, diagnostics, and digital products, and we've got the biggest clinical guidelines portfolio in the world.
Thank you, Sam. Deus?
And I'm Deus Mubangizi. I'm the unit head for Prequalification in the World Health Organization based in Geneva. The Prequalification sometimes may be a misleading name. We don't pre-qualify companies for a tender or not, but it's a regulatory exercise for evaluation of products for global access, or product streams, starting with vaccines, therapeutics or medicines, in vitro diagnostics, and vector control products. And we do that mainly for the global access, and we do that working with the established regulatory systems, but also focusing on the needs of low and medium income countries, and also to do some bit of regulatory-based market shaping for access in low and medium income countries. I've been with the Prequalification since 2008, full-time since 2008, and part-time since 2004. But before that, I was 14 years in my country, Uganda, which I call the Pearl of Africa, according to Sir Winston Churchill, where I actually established the regulatory system there from scratch. And I have been also part of the African harmonization initiatives right there from the start. And now in my new responsibility, also participating in the global harmonization initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Deus. And Steffen?
Yeah, afternoon. I'm Steffen Thirstrup. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at the European Medicines Agency. I've been so for the past year, so I'm new there. But I've been doing European regulatory affairs for the past 20 years, 10 years before joining the agency as a strategic regulatory consultant in a global consulting company. And before that, the head of the licensing division in Denmark, the Danish member of CHMP in the committee systems in the European agency. And we don't deal with access, or well, we might be an obstacle to access or the pathway to access, but increasingly, of course, we are working, because as Per in the previous panel alluded to, the new legislation proposed by the European Commission has very much focus on access and availability, but that was for the previous panel, but access and affordability. And we are having the HTA regulation coming into, well, it has come into force, but it will be going live by January 2025 with joint clinical assessment, and we hope that that will increase also the number of parallel scientific advices with regulators.
Thank you, Steffen. So I think you can see we've got a very diverse panel representing a huge number of different countries here today. I'd like to kick off the panel with a very broad question, really asking each of you to think about or share with the audience what are the biggest challenges in global access to medicines that you see. I realise there's going to be unique elements to this from each of your contexts. If you could also think a little bit about some of the potentially common elements as well of those challenges that might be common to all jurisdictions. And maybe I'll start this end and move that way this time. I will be coming to the audience for questions, so please do think about questions, and I'll take those to the floor as they come.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. I think there's a tendency to look at Europe as a very homogeneous region, despite we being 27 different member states and speaking 24 different languages. But if you look at market access and market uptake, there is a huge diversity going from the rich northwestern part of Europe to the less rich southeastern part of Europe. And that also not only applies to innovative medicines, but also to generics and to biosimilars. I've been very much involved in biosimilars, and there is a huge difference. And when we talk about biosimilars for the southeastern part of Europe, it also comes to a low uptake of originator products. So the market for competition is also smaller. I think the challenge putting that aside, in Europe is very much into the new, very expensive, primarily AT&P products, where healthcare systems, primarily tax-financed healthcare systems, are struggling to find the money. And I think they also are struggling to find new ways of payment models for these products.
Thank you. Dennis.
Well, as I introduced myself, we focus mainly on the low and medium income countries, and these have special challenges. First of all, they are weak and fragmented regulatory systems. The previous panel was talking about predictability. Predictability even of the requirements or even the processes that you need to go to supply this area is a very big challenge. And that makes certain players fear of the unknown. They don't want to venture into these markets because they don't know what it takes to be in these markets. Or even when they know, they find the system so fragmented that it does not produce the economies of scale to be able to supply. So that is a big challenge. And related to that is the logistical systems that are attributed to that. You know, you're talking about 27 languages, or 24 languages, and you go to my own country, Uganda, we have 15 different dialects within that market, and people that are strongly nationalistic. Everybody wants to see their language on that level. I remember the previous panel here, there was somebody from GSK. My first month in regulation in 1994, my first encounter was a counterfeit product that had been, they had counterfeited a GSK product. And we did our work, and then a team flew actually from UK to my country. And I was telling these executives and said, do you know what? You need to put special language and also tamper-proof marks for our market to be able to go. And the man looked at me and said, young man, the whole of African continent is 0.01% of the market. You want me to do a special production line for 0.0000001% of the market? It does not make economies of scale. So when you have such a fragmented market in terms of requirements and all, that becomes a barrier to access. And I'll come back to say, what are we doing about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Sam?
Great. So, I mean, we see the life of the medicine as having kind of 3 episodes. You know, there's your research episode, there's your market access episode, which is regulation and HTA, and then there's your uptake episode. So let's leave research because we're not talking about it today. On the market access episode, there's a couple of issues that are happening right now, which I mean, obvious, I think all of you will know. One is volume is increasing really exponentially. So for NICE, the volume of medicines appraisals we do every year has increased by 30% in the last 3 years. And this is the graph going upwards. So even in countries like us, where our government has invested heavily in regulation and HTA, we're struggling with capacity and capability. So I can imagine that's kind of a global phenomenon. And you know, health economists, et cetera, don't grow on trees. So there's something about that. The approach that we're having to take to deal with that is to say we have to be really careful about what we look at, and we have to be much more proportionate in our appraisals. So we're really trying to streamline what are the quite simple medicines where we understand the pathway, we understand the comparator. Let's do those in a streamlined, quick way. And we did a couple of pilots last year where we could kind of shorten the time by about 45%. So there's definitely kind of potential there, but you know, is that going to get us through the whole way of the uptick in the pathway? Uncertain. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is kind of exercising HTA agencies around the world, is that regulators are moving more and more and more towards accepting, giving medicines licenses on intermediate endpoints, which make complete sense in terms of saying, is there a clinical signal? Tick, there is. When we come to say how much is that clinical signal worth in terms of quality and length of life, it's almost impossible to say. So there's this big kind of gap between, we have an intermediate endpoint, but is it validated in terms of length and quality of life? No. So I think that's the second thing that we find. So, problems in the regulatory stroke HTA landscape, but I would say that those are tiny in comparison to the uptake landscape, where, even in countries like this where we're blessed to have wonderful, doesn't get great press, but wonderful primary care relative to other countries, uptake even of old medicines that have got massive clinical effects and extremely cost effective is poor. So for example, our most recent cholesterol guideline looked at the people that have been given atorvastatin, remember that old favorite. Less than 50% of the people who should get it will be given atorvastatin in primary prevention in this country. So, uptake's not generally poor across the board. It's actually pretty good in specialty. It's pretty good in cancer. It's slightly less good in secondary care, non-cancer, but it still remains pretty poor in primary care, and that's in a country with actually pretty good primary care. So if I were to focus anywhere, that's where I'd focus.
Okay, Thank you, Sam. Mac?
Yeah. As Deus was saying, the parts of the world that he and I focus on have very complex and difficult access issues. And the one I think that is quite different from the world here in Europe and the world in North America is that it's not a matter of access. It's a matter of access to quality versions of products. It's not a problem we have here. You go to a pharmacy here in London, you go to a hospital here in London, you never have to think about, does that product actually have the medicine in it? Does it actually have the right amount of medicine in it? Does it have sawdust in it? Because you have very strong systems here to make sure that the medicines that you have access to are quality versions of medicines. Now, the work that Deus does in pre-qualification tries to answer that. And despite all of the efforts, and we are huge supporters of the work that Deus does, but when you look at the WHO's essential medicines list, pre-qualification is not like the MHRA or the EMA, where anybody can just go drop their application and somebody has to take a look at it. Only 10% of the WHO's essential medicines list is even eligible to go through pre-qualification. So the ones that get to go are HIV, malaria, TB, family planning, and some others. But other than insulin, not diabetes, not heart disease, not antibiotics, not cancer. And the issue of the versions of those drugs that show up in the low and middle income markets is a major public health crisis when you look at the substandard products that people have access to. And so when we talk about access, we're not talking about does somebody get a pill, but does somebody get a pill that actually might be able to help them? And that's a unique problem that Deus and I and others that focus on other parts of the world. And I think it's often hard when you are working for an organization and working with organizations where people come from a European or a North American background and they just think, well, of course access is to quality versions because that's been their entire experience. So yeah.
Thank you, Mac. I mean, so it's really interesting. I'm hearing it's about quality and maybe more about quality of sort of medicines, maybe unbranded medicines even. And yet Steffen was talking about the challenges of ATMPs. It strikes me that pre-Galien is obviously all about rewarding innovation, but innovation is a somewhat overused term. In life sciences companies, obviously everything that is developed is an innovation. I wonder if I could actually, while I'm waiting for questions for the audience, ask about what innovation means to you in your context. Maybe we can start off with Sam and Steffen, because I think your view of innovation might differ somewhat from Max and Deus.
I mean, I could give like an hour's talk on what innovation means to NICE, but I'll just kind of boil it down. Of course, we have a formula for everything. So for us, broadly, we think that innovation that we should pay more for has got two components. Either it's better quality of life or longer length of life, and that's what we include in the thing we call our severity modifier. So we say we treat everything equal unless you show us, the medicine, show us that you've got a huge gain in length of life or huge gain in quality of life. We multiply those things. And for medicines that have got much more of both of those things combined, we're happy to pay a higher price. So there's many, many other ways that we look at innovation, but that's the kind of simple way that applies to all of the medicines that we look at. Length and quality of life combined.
Thank you, Sam. Steffen?
The official language in the European agency would, of course, be a product that fulfills an unmet medical need and, of course, fulfills the requirement for quality, efficacy, and safety. I think personally, I also think about innovation as something that moves science forward. So scientific innovations, speaking as a clinical pharmacologist, new targets, better understanding of pathophysiology, approaching diseases that were here to suboptimal treated or maybe untreated, that you can approach them with a new knowledge and a new technology. That's also innovation for me. Of course, all links back to, is there clinical need for these products? So we're not just talking about me toos.
Thank you. Deus and Mac?
Again, we look at innovation from maybe an access angle. What will that innovation promote? Access. Now, access in low and medium income countries. I think in the previous panel you asked about single dose versus multi-dose. For vaccines, for example, we have created what we call programmatic suitability characteristics. These are characteristics that we feel are important to make to enable the product easily deliverable and usable under the health systems of low and medium income countries. Because yes, if it is good and wonderful and cannot be used in the health systems, then it will not be. So it is sort of, we direct R&D to innovate for those characteristics that will enable. One you've talked about is the multi-dose versus single dose. Whereas a single dose will be better for patient safety and all that, but will increase the cold chain volume and logistics for low and medium income countries. And that will not be, it's simply not there. So it will not be accessible in those countries. Secondly, we're talking about sticking even to that cold chain. We talk about the ability to withstand the environmental conditions. Whereas you can guarantee that here power will not go off and all that, often it will not. It's not the case in my. So we request for those vaccines, the same that may be approved here, that each vial should have a vaccine vial monitor, which is to detect the impact of cumulative exposure to temperature. That is important for, otherwise, even a good product would be exposed to extreme temperatures and will be degraded at the time of use. When we go back to the same point about multi-dose and single dose, the moment you go to multi-dose, that means that vial will be punctured and used maybe over a period, we say a period of 6. That means you may need a preservative, which may not be necessary for a single dose. And so there are a number of characteristics that we say should be, so that we have published then in the programmatic suitability to say, please look at these. If you can innovate, your innovation should focus on this. You will produce products that will be accessible to that type of population. And let me just say one point. Yes, it is a low income, but the population of middle class is growing in this. So it's no longer a market to neglect, even so it's important to look at some of the things as you innovate for this market.
Thank you, Deus. Can I get a microphone to Mark? And while we're waiting for the microphone, Mac, any further comments on this question?
I think, it's interesting. During all of my time at FDA, I always had the impression that industry defined innovation by how many new chemical entities were authorized each year. It seemed like that was the goal of December 31st, was to see how many FDA had authorized that year. It didn't matter how many other products or variations or whatever that might have public health impact. It was the NCEs. And I think it's interesting nowadays, when you look at that list, it's primarily made up of orphan drugs or cancer drugs, or very, very specially focused kinds of things. And we can argue why that has happened and what the motivation behind that is. But it bothers me to think, well, how relevant is that? And how relevant are the efforts at innovation, if that is how we define innovation in the global north, to what's going on in the countries that Deus and I focus on. There is one, though, and I think it's going to be an interesting access issue in our world, Deus, and that is the new therapies that are coming out for sickle cell, because they are what we would consider very innovative, and in our countries are going to be very expensive, but the major population for them are in the countries that Deus and I focus on. And so, how that kind of innovation, true innovation, that would have a major impact in West Africa, for example, are going to be translated into access there, I think is going to be one of the real challenges going forward.
Thank you, Mac. Mark.
I mean, I suppose that takes me to my question, really, which is, well, I'll preface it by saying that these conversations have been going on for decades now, and we haven't made very much progress. But it strikes me as completely ironic that governments on the whole take counterfeiting a children's video game more seriously than they take counterfeiting drugs, whereas counterfeiting an antibiotic amounts to murder, actually. But I guess my question is local manufacturing going to be the answer? I mean, how much of the issue is the cost of goods is high, and how much is that the access is driven by the market in the developed world? And so when it comes to sickle, which is a very good example, where actually the market in terms of number of people who would benefit is much greater in Africa, why don't we simply put up factories there and let them manufacture at an effective price in relation to the cost of goods and try and solve the problem that way? Maybe that's just too naive.
I'm not sure it's naive, because as Deus and others can talk to here, post-COVID, the whole political impetus to put up local manufacturing because of, once again, being at the end of the queue, which is what our colleagues experienced and continue to experience. I mean, that political horse has left the barn. And there's tremendous support around the world. I mean, the European Union is giving over €1 billion to help with local manufacturing in Africa. I think from our perspective, the question comes back, again, local manufacturing of quality versions of products. Just, putting out pills that have dubious quality or unknown quality is not going to help. It will simply exacerbate the problem that exists. And that's where, the work of Deus and the work of his colleagues who are trying to strengthen the local regulatory agencies there. I mean, if you look in Africa right now, there are 55 countries, only 5, and it's only happened in the last several years, have reached what we would consider a minimum level of being able to adequately oversee their markets when it comes to the quality of the products on their market. None of them have reached a European level or North American level what you really need to have a closed, safe market when it comes to the quality of the products on that market. So yes, will local manufacturing help parts of it? And I think from my perspective, it will from the following. If a manufacturer, wherever they are, and there are manufacturers in India and other parts of the world who legally market their products. They have authorized versions of their products here and in North America. But they know that if they send substandard versions here, there's a high probability it will be caught, and there will be consequences for that. There will be economic consequences, there will be judicial consequences. There is a system for protecting the market here. That simply does not exist. You can send garbage into some of the countries we work on. There are no consequences. Whether it will be picked up is quite, minimal. And if it is picked up, what are the consequences for doing it? So it's a multifactorial problem of making sure that what comes in is quality and that the agencies there have the authority and the ability to detect it and to enforce it, whether it's locally manufactured or if it's imported.
So Deus, anything to add to that? And then this $1 billion of investment, Steffen, perhaps you can comment
So
on
just
that.
to add, and I just came back from Kenya and Rwanda on similar missions. Actually, we were a big delegation of about 5 to try and address this. First of all, is to change even the narrative. Sometimes local manufacturing has been interpreted that each and every country must have a factory within. And we are actually saying that if you see the WHO resolution, they defined what local manufacturing, in fact, we are, in our narrative, we are saying regional manufacturing rather than local, to make sure that we don't send these motivations for inefficient, inappropriate manufacturing. The second point I would like to add is, and the point I gave to the local manufacturers in Cape Town in November, but I've repeated in Kenya and Rwanda last week, is that what Mark has just said. First of all, the minimum must be quality. If there is no quality, don't talk about manufacturing. What you access must be quality. And for it to be viable, I had 5 statements. One, there must be quality, and there must be then consistent. It's not a one-off. You have just manufactured, especially people when they're struggling for the first authorization, they'll put a lot of effort, and then maintenance goes down. So consistency. Once you have quality and consistency, you will build trust. Trust by the regulators, trust by the health system, trust by the patient. And once that trust is gained, it will give you the market and then bring sustainability. So that needs to be the consequences. We are talking about, we have 194 member states. Out of those, only 30% of the countries, out of approximately 57, have maturity level 3 and 4. And that means 70%, over 100 countries, across 150, 140, have either non-existence or immature regulatory system. If you have been seeing the alerts that we give, simple cough syrups with diethyl glycol that was caused, FDS 37, 1930s. 100 years ago. But it is still a problem. People dying in hundreds. Gambia, over 150. Now, now we are dealing with cases in Cameroon. So it's not manufacturing for the sake of manufacturing. There must be regulatory systems to oversee. And that's why currently we are saying that if you are going to support local manufacturing, with regional manufacturing, you should equally be able to support the regulatory system. Manufacturing without a requisite regulatory system is actually a risk for this, for this world. And there are countries even that are hubs of manufacturing systems currently that need to up their regulatory system so that they reduce their risk to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. I know that there's a couple of questions at the back there, so if we can get a microphone over there. Steffen, did you have a comment on this one?
Yeah, but just to add to say that some of the money that the European Union is spending on this is actually to build the capacity. As you and I talked about before we went on here, the only other place in the world where you have a regulatory system that builds on multinational collaboration is in Europe. And now you establish in the African Medicines Agency, where I believe we can learn you a lot, and we are learning, working with you on building that system, where I agree, trust in the assessment that the guy down the road is doing is actually good enough, so I don't need to redo it. I can believe what he's doing. We have the same standards and so forth. That's what we did in Europe in the 1980s before we built the centralized procedure. So again, that is taking place in Africa. And we are heavily involved. Our international office works with WHO. We've been involved in some of those biontainers that BioNTech is planning to roll out for vaccine, local vaccine manufacturing, and helping setting them up in terms of what are the quality expectations and so forth. So we do a lot there. Yeah.
Thank you, Steffen.
Sure. Hi, Nathan Sigworth again from CCX. Sam, you mentioned two things that struck me. One is with this incredible innovation, there's more work to be done in access. And second, because of the nature of these new medicines, that work is more complex, managing risk and uncertainty and so forth, which is only going to be exacerbated by sickle cell and some of these other innovations. A few of us here are from the world of tech and venture capital and foundations, and I guess my question is, as we think about how to best support the increasing workload in market access, most of this has to be done by people, by humans, right? But how can, what are some of the most boring, some of the most time-consuming, some of the most soul-destroying aspects of market access work that could be offloaded to tech and AI in the future?
Great question. Can I answer? Okay, so I think there's at least three parts to this. The first, with increasing uncertainty, is we're just going to have to collect more real-world data, and we are very blessed in this country to have the SACT data set, even though everybody gives it a hard time. So for cancer, we can actually collect real-world data pretty quickly. We struggle when we don't have it, and we have to come up with registries, et cetera. So I think that there is something about working with the combined data lakes, or whatever they're called now, in NHS England, and we look forward to those with kind of interest. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we do an amazing amount of systematic reviews. You would be surprised, both ourselves and our external assessment groups. So we've started using AI for kind of screening of abstract extractions, et cetera, but I'm sure there's more that we could do on that, on kind of the evidence review, just to make sure that we've collected the right evidence, and then the human does all the assessing for bias and quality of the evidence, et cetera. And then the third thing, which may go down like a lead balloon in this room, is as a health economist, one of the things that drives me mad is that we keep on seeing different health economic models on the same condition. And then we end up arguing with different countries about companies about exactly the same parameter that we argued with another company about last week on a different model. So what we're going to try to do at NICE, what we are doing at NICE is we're saying, what about if your HTA agency had a standard health economic model for a condition? So we're starting this year with renal cell carcinoma, with one decision node for non-small cell lung cancer, and with one on multiple myeloma, where we say, this is the standard model. We're not going to argue about the model structure. These are the standard parameters in terms of qualities, et cetera, and then you can come to us and tell us what you think the effect of your medicine is. So maintaining these models is not straightforward, and so we're trying to collaborate with some international colleagues. For example, in Denmark, we're collaborating with Zin, et cetera. So I think that's the third element. But these are just the little early shoots of what we could be doing with more tech and data. I'm sure there's much more that our learned colleagues have thought about.
Thank you, Sam. Deus and I had a conversation about digital in some of the low and middle income markets. I know it's a slightly off topic. We were talking about imaging in TB, for example. Could you just comment on that, and then I'll take the other question over there.
Different dynamic altogether. This is about TB. That's a big problem, and it's diagnosed by an X-ray, but you need an expert, a radiologist, to read this, and these radiologists are not there in all where these patients. So what we are doing is with computer-aided diagnostic for TB, where you train a software to diagnose and we are actually now pre-qualifying card for TB for TB, starting with screening so that, and the biggest debate that we have here is for what intended use, because for where they exist, it is to assist a radiologist. But for us, we are talking about replace, because there's, and then the debate is, we don't have such an authorization in Europe, and it's not allowed, but it is the need. So and if we are going to have early detection and treatment of TB and stop multi-resistance or TB, we need these tools. And so talking about innovating for the low and medium income country, but now using AI or machine learning. Yeah. Thanks.
And so I'm definitely not going to steal from Stephanie's panel, which is all about AI in healthcare. So maybe I'll push that into a later panel. But I think there's a huge role for technology in patient access. We had another question up at the back.
Thank you. Martin Gisby, Market Access Advisor to Industry. This question, I think, is complementary to Nathan's one. It is focused on Europe, so maybe one for Sam and Steffen. We've seen some really great evolution in regulatory pathways over the years to allow products that meet unmet need, to get to the market or to get to the regulatory approval stage. We do observe there is a gap between some of that ability to get a regulatory authorization and then what happens at the market access stage. And maybe we could term it as a less flexible approach, at the national level. And there's that gap between, what you can get through on a regulatory and into market access. It's not a great insight because we all know that it's there. But my question is, what are the latest initiatives to help try and bridge that gap, especially, as you said, Sam, with more and more volume coming through, so maybe less time to think about it for these products? Thank you.
Maybe, Steffen, you could take that first, because the regulatory and then the HTA. Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest step forward, and it still has to deliver its promise, is the joint clinical assessment that is part of the new HTA regulation in Europe that has tried to bring national HTA bodies together in the same way as the regulatory bodies has been brought together in the licensing part. So to work together, but to Sam's point, they also struggle to agree on which model to use for a certain condition. I was in a meeting where they discussed what are the appropriate comparator for lung cancer, and they came up with 19 different comparators. So you cannot do an economical model with 19 different comparators, and you can definitely not do the clinical trials to support that. So, but I think there are promises there, because we, as the European agency, we have been working with, flirting with, and have a matrix now with the HTA bodies that comes out of the European, the UNETA, which started back in the 90s, and now is coming to an end because that will be taken over by a coordination group, that common assessment. So trying to harmonize some of the guidances, of course realizing that the purpose are different, whether licensing or market access, but at least trying to have some commonalities in that guidance. And of course, working with them further on to set up the system, because that would be a completely new pan-EU, not committee is called, but a coordination group that would work. So I think that looks promising, and it will start out with oncology products and ATMPs. That's where the healthcare systems are having the biggest hurdles. I think that's interesting. To your point, Sam, and I was about to raise my hand, use of real-world data or real-world evidence is very much starting to get implemented. The European agency have launched the Darwin EU, a federated network of databases to look into different studies, and we already have 5 on its way being published within the first year. And the plan is quite ambitious to have 150 studies coming out of Darwin on an annual basis. We are still working with our HTA colleagues to embrace, to the same extent, real-world evidence and real-world data, because for us it's making the regulatory decision on surrogate endpoints and believing that this is for the benefit of patients, and we want to have the real-world evidence coming afterwards, reassuring us. But for the payers, this may sometimes be a little bit, sometimes it's birds on the roof they're paying for, they feel, so that's still a discussion that's ongoing, and I'm happy to hear that NICE is more embracing, because I feel some of my European counterparts are less optimistic and you're less prone to use real-world evidence.
And it needs a healthy dose of pragmatism, I think, some of
the
initiatives.
And not all HTA bodies in Europe are pragmatic, no.
Sam, your thoughts?
I won't add that much more to what's said. I think that the issue with real-world evidence is it's not all created equal. So, you have to be careful about the provenance, the way it's reported, that, data points aren't excluded, etc. So I think what we are seeing now between HTA bodies is quite a lot of collaboration on real-world evidence frameworks. So, for example, we published ours at NICE last year. The ISPOR, task force is doing one, which is not that dissimilar from ours. The US has got one, etc. So I think there's being clear what good and bad real-world evidence is an important thing. And so we're starting with a framework, but I see Jane, one of our wonderful ex-committee chairs here. A lot of it is also about sitting in committees and talking through what we think is good and not good real-world evidence, because for committees, sometimes this will be new. So there's something about standards in real-world evidence and then getting the people who make the decisions about medicines comfortable. The second thing I'd say is, I'm not going to, hash over the thing about surrogate endpoints again, because it's really important, and that kind of validate. The second thing I'd say is surrogate endpoints, super important to validate them, and we are really hoping that with the Inflation Reduction Act and price negotiations coming in the US at year 8 and 10, that companies will really start to collect lots of good data, real-world data on meaningful clinical endpoints. So hopefully that is kind of pushing us all in the right direction, that we're collecting meaningful clinical endpoints and then we're going to validate the surrogates. That's the second thing. The third thing I'd say is I'm just going to be pragmatic. The world between regulators and HTA bodies is diverging, right? Regulators are saying faster, 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 and governments are saying we do not have enough money to pay for medicines. So when you've got the US saying they're going to do price negotiations at year 8 and 10, when you've got China with a national formulary list that's got an average discount of 67%, we cannot pretend that there is enough money to pay for all of the uncertainty in all the medicines that have got regulatory approval. And that's what all the HTA bodies say over the world. So all the real-world data and all the surrogate endpoint validation is kind of not going to address the fundamental affordability issue, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Sam. So, Munir, you had a question. Can we get a microphone down here, please? Mac, do you want to comment quickly on this while we're waiting?
I just wanted to ask a question, and it's really to Sam. Wearing my old FDA hat here, when we would have to get to the point of authorizing a medicine, I remember it was this situation where you felt like at some point you had this magic moment where this is an investigational product and then you have a magic moment. And I remember when I used to sign the approval letters, I would say, oh my God, 350 million people now can take this. I've got a database of, maybe 3,000, and all of a sudden now, after the magic moment, 350 million people are eligible for access to this product. And when and that tends to make for a conservative approach when you have to base everything on this magic moment. And when we got to having to think about the accelerated approvals, which was always a terrible name, I thought, but it was really saying, instead of having a magic moment, we were really going to have an iterative licensing approach, that we were going to learn, and the community was willing to accept it for these particular products that were meeting an unmet need, because they were saying, you know, what we don't know about the disease, about the drug, is okay because of what we know about the disease. And we were willing to take that benefit-risk profile. And so, as I say, you know, as you look at this divergence, a lot of it seems to be, to me, because the regulators are thinking more about an iterative process of licensing. Whereas I hear you saying you're still looking at the magic moment. And my question to you is, would you ever imagine from the HTA that you would have an iterative process and that you could pay less for less knowledge, and then as knowledge is gained, it would have more value, and that you would see the economic value of more knowledge as a way of actually enticing people to get the knowledge at the end of the day? Or is that simply not doable in your system?
So Mark wants to get in on this, but I also have a question here, and we're running out of time. But
the opposite of real-world evidence is unreal-world evidence, and I think we handle much too much of that. And the way to deal with bias, there's always bias in observational data, but is to have people independent of the companies doing the assessment. And that way, and we've got so much evidence in the NHS because we've got 60 million people plus. So I think we've just got to move that. And it builds on Matt's point. There's a real difference when you use it in the real world from what a clinical trial is likely to show in the first place.
Yeah. So I think that there are two answers to that. One is what we're doing now and what a future could look like. Yeah. So what we're doing now, we agree with you. I mean, obviously, there is no magic moment. So about 10%, I'd say, of the 100 medicines we look at a year go into managed access agreements, which are just that. They say, we don't know enough, collect data between a year and 3 years, and we'll make a decision, pay less on the price, and then we'll reevaluate at the end. Great. The problem with reevaluating at the end is the price almost always goes down, incidentally. It very seldom comes up. So that is something that we are doing, and the Innovative Medicines Fund should expand that beyond cancer. I think, so the interesting thought experiment which we've been doing, this is not nice policy, I should say, is that basically that means that the payer is taking all the risk for risky medicines, but the producer is taking some of the manufacturer is taking some of the risk on price. But for the unreal studies that most of our medicines have, the payer is taking 100% of the risk, right? Because we just approve it, we say, you've got market access, off you go, we're never going to look at you again. Is there a world in which we say everything is a rolling appraisal? And then you run into exactly the issues that we have with our, so firstly, capacity. We don't even have capacity to do one. So we would have to be much more efficient with these things like core models, et cetera. But then the second thing is you end up taking medicines away from patients. And that's what's happened with our managed access agreements. We sometimes can't agree to a price. And then there are so for people who live a long period of time, manufacturers can't take the medicine away, so then the manufacturer pays for it and the government doesn't. So it's kind of, do you see what I mean? It's not just us taking risk, it's manufacturers taking risk that their medicine could be withdrawn and they will have to pay for it when it's withdrawn. Yeah.
Thank you. So your question, Munir, perhaps you could direct it to the panelists you'd like to answer, because we're running out of time. Thanks.
Thanks. So my question relates to the geographical variation in access to innovation. First part of it relates to the UK, and you mentioned the variation with atorvastatin, for example. And there may be some structural issues, but actually part of the problem in difficulties in adoption is behavior change from clinicians. And I just want to know how you're tackling behavior change And that's so the second relates to the more global issues and access to highly innovative therapies, such as sickle cell disease therapy. And I work in some of the sub-Saharan African countries to be able to work on medicines and access and so on. And it's not just the social responsibility of the companies providing the access to the highly innovative therapies, such as the sort of gene editing for sickle cell. It's actually also the ability of the healthcare system to be able to cope with that. Because if you are going to do that gene editing, you need preparation of the patient. You need the bone marrow sorting out, etc., before you give that. And there's just not the capacity or the capabilities to be able to do that as well. And just wondering how we can actually tackle that. That's an impossible question to answer, I know, but that is a difficulty in making sure those highly innovative therapies get to the people who really need it.
Okay, so let's take that as the sort of closing question for the panel. You have an option either around the healthcare system implementation piece or behaviour change. Maybe each of you could give a comment on that. Matt,
we're going that
let's
way
go
now?
this way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we would agree with you entirely. I mean, when we talk about the work that we do on building a quality regulatory system, it only has meaning if it is one of the legs of a three-legged stool in a quality healthcare system. And we've always made that argument. You can have the world's best clinicians and the world's best facilities and the crappiest products, and you have a terrible healthcare system. I mean, if any of the three legs is not quality, you do not have a quality healthcare system. And I think you're saying that, all the work we do to make the regulatory system quality, and we can authorize a gene therapy, but if the healthcare system is not able to take it, what's the point? And so it is a more comprehensive approach to developing a quality healthcare system that has to be undertaken.
Thank you, Matt. Sam?
Okay, you could say 1,000 things on uptake, but the one thing I'll say that I think is relevant to this audience is clinicians think in terms of pathways and classes of medicine. They don't think in terms of your product. So the best thing that you can do, which I know is hard for you as companies, is to collaborate across class and across pathway. Because, inclisiran, great example, you don't have anybody on atorvastatin, they're probably not getting inclisiran. Yeah. And, you don't get anybody on ezetimibe, they're probably not getting inclisiran either. So it kind of speak the language of clinicians, which is pathway and class, it's not product.
Thank you, Sam.
I was intrigued by the discussion about the different comparators for HT across Europe. And just to show how indirect behavior change. Now, because pre-qualification is serving the low and medium income countries that don't, we for each product that is invited, we designate what a comparator should be, for example, for a bioequivalence system. And what has because of the trust that we have gained by the payers, the funders, the health systems, it automatically accepted. So instead of each country asking for their own bioequivalence system, one comparator now provides access to over 100 countries. And these are some of the things that that can actually facilitate access. And, the other one, talking about competition, I want to use the issue of ARVs. ARVs, and when we started in 2001, to get a treatment, a course of treatment for 1 month for one patient was anything close to 5,000 to 10,000. You can now get a cost of treatment as low as $50, if not less. And the trust in the competition, not the trash, access to the trash that talk about, generic, well evaluated that has and paid through global programs has enabled access. And as a result of that, talking about savings, we had an independent study that was done by McKinsey in 2008 and said, as a result of the savings, up to 400 million more patients have been put on treatment as a result of some of these decisions may be simple, but they translate into real life. And once the system trusts you, then they will change the behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. Steffen, last comment.
I think it's difficult to come with anything new here. I very much liked your three-legged chair, whatever it was, which is actually a quite nice picture.
I have a slide.
Yeah. Okay. Good. It's because it won't fly without all three of them. And I think from our perspective, we can of course help low and middle income countries not building the healthcare system, but the regulatory system. And part of that is also learning to trust others and collaborate.
Thank you, Steffen. So I'm sorry we've run out of time. I couldn't get to all of the audience questions, but thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you so much to the panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Very enjoyable panel. Thank you.